But there was another Robin Williams. A father. A husband. A son. And a person who, away from the cameras, lived a life very different from the energetic comedian audiences saw on stage. For millions of people, Robin Williams was almost impossible to imagine without a smile. His voice was fast. His imagination seemed endless. And his performances could transform an ordinary moment into something unforgettable. But inside his family, he wasn't simply the man who made millions laugh. He was Dad. And that part of his identity mattered deeply. Robin was born in Chicago in 1951 and grew up in a comfortable family environment. His father, Robert Fitzgerald Williams, worked in the automobile industry, while his mother, Laurie McLaurin, had a background in entertainment. From an early age, Robin was exposed to different influences. There was education. There was family. And there was performance. But his future wasn't obvious at first. As Robin grew older, he discovered that comedy could become more than entertainment. It could become a way of connecting with people. Eventually, his career exploded. Television made him recognizable. Stand-up made him famous. Hollywood turned him into a global star. But while the world watched his career grow, Robin's personal life was also changing. He became a father. And fatherhood gave him a role that was completely different from performing on a stage. Robin had 3 children. Zach, Zelda, and Cody. Each child experienced a different side of their father. To the world, Robin could be unpredictable, energetic, and almost impossible to keep up with. At home, however, he could simply be their dad. His children grew up knowing that their father was famous. But fame wasn't necessarily what defined him inside the family. Like any parent, he had responsibilities. He had family moments. He had ordinary days. And he had to balance those moments with a career that demanded enormous amounts of time and energy. That balance wasn't always easy. Hollywood can make family life complicated. Movies require travel. Performances require long hours. Public appearances attract attention. And when someone becomes as famous as Robin Williams, privacy becomes difficult to protect. Yet his children were able to see something that audiences rarely saw. The person behind the performer. The man behind the characters. The father behind the famous voice. And that distinction became increasingly important as his children grew older. Zach, Robin's eldest son, eventually pursued a career connected to the world of entertainment and later became involved in advocacy work. Zelda followed her own path into acting, writing, and directing. And Cody, the youngest, largely maintained a more private life while still remaining connected to his family's legacy. 3 children. 3 different personalities. 3 different lives. But one famous father. And perhaps the most interesting part of their story is that none of them needed to become another Robin Williams. Their father had already created his own extraordinary career. They were free to create theirs. As Robin's fame grew, his children also had to deal with something most families never experience. People already knew their father's name. Strangers recognized him. Fans wanted photographs. The media wanted stories. And wherever Robin went, attention often followed. For his family, that meant learning how to live alongside fame without allowing fame to become their entire lives. Robin himself understood the difference between public and private life. The world knew the comedian. His family knew the father. And those 2 versions of Robin could exist at the same time. That is what makes his family story so powerful. Because when we look back at Robin Williams today, it is easy to remember only the laughter. The characters. The movies. The performances. But his children remember something much more personal. They remember a father. A person whose legacy wasn't only built in Hollywood. It was also built inside his family. And after Robin's death in 2014, that family became the people carrying many of those memories forward. His children didn't simply inherit his name. They inherited a history. A collection of stories. And a connection to one of the most beloved entertainers of his generation. But their lives after Robin would become another chapter entirely. Because once the cameras stopped. Once the interviews ended. And once the world began remembering Robin Williams as a legend. His family had to continue living with the person they had lost. And that is where the real story begins. To the world, Robin Williams was a legendary comedian and actor. To his children, he was something much simpler. Dad. Robin had 3 children from different chapters of his life, Zach, Zelda, and Cody. Each grew up with a very different perspective on their famous father. Being Robin Williams' child meant living with an unusual reality. Your father could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. People recognized his voice. They recognized his face. They wanted to hear him tell stories. But once the cameras disappeared, Robin could return to being a father. For his children, those private moments mattered far more than the fame. His eldest son, Zach Williams, eventually developed his own career and became involved in advocacy and mental health-related work. Rather than simply relying on his father's name, Zach chose to build a path connected to his own experiences and interests. His relationship with Robin remained an important part of his life. But he wasn't trying to become another comedian. He was creating his own identity. Then there was Zelda Williams. Growing up with Robin as her father meant growing up around Hollywood, but Zelda eventually entered entertainment herself. She explored acting, writing, directing, and other creative work. In some ways, the connection was natural. She had grown up watching her father transform into different characters. She understood the creative world from the inside. But Zelda also had to deal with the unavoidable comparison. When people heard the name Williams, they immediately thought of Robin. That could make it difficult for his children to be judged simply on their own work. Yet Zelda continued developing her own voice. Her career became her own story. And then came Cody Williams, Robin's youngest child. Compared with his siblings, Cody has generally maintained a lower public profile. That difference is significant. The children of a famous person don't all have to follow the same path. One may embrace entertainment. Another may work in advocacy. Another may choose privacy. All 3 choices are valid. And that's exactly what happened with Robin's children. They inherited the same father. But they didn't inherit the same dreams. Robin's fame also created another unusual experience for them. Millions of people felt connected to him. Fans watched his movies repeatedly. They remembered his comedy. They considered him part of their own childhoods. But for his children, the relationship was much more personal. They didn't see a Hollywood legend every day. They saw the person who was part of their family. That difference became even more meaningful after Robin's death. In 2014, the world lost Robin Williams. For fans, it was the loss of an extraordinary entertainer. For his children, it was the loss of their father. The grief was private, but the attention was public. Suddenly, people around the world were talking about Robin's life. His movies were being revisited. His performances were being remembered. Tributes appeared everywhere. But his family had to experience the loss away from the stage. And over time, his children began finding their own ways to honor him. They didn't need to recreate his career. They could simply preserve what mattered. His kindness. His creativity. His humor. His love for his family. And the memories that belonged to them. That became an important part of the Williams family legacy. Robin had spent his career making other people feel something. His children continued carrying the memory of the person who existed behind that public image. And perhaps that's one of the most beautiful parts of his story. A person's legacy isn't always measured by awards or box office numbers. Sometimes it lives through the people who knew them best. Robin Williams left behind 3 children who each chose a different road. But all 3 remain connected by the same extraordinary history. The history of a father who made millions laugh, while his children knew him simply as Dad. And the next chapter looks beyond the family itself. Because Robin's fame didn't only affect his children. It affected the way the entire family experienced privacy, public attention, and life in Hollywood. Robin Williams lived in 2 very different worlds. One was the world everyone knew. Bright lights, movie premieres, television appearances, sold-out performances, and audiences waiting for him to make them laugh. The other world was much quieter. It was his family life. And keeping those 2 worlds separate wasn't always easy. Robin became famous during a time when celebrity culture was growing rapidly. But unlike today, social media didn't exist. There wasn't a camera in everyone's pocket. Even so, famous people still struggled to maintain privacy. For Robin's family, his fame meant that ordinary moments could sometimes feel less ordinary. Going out in public could attract attention. People recognized Robin. Fans wanted to talk to him. Photographers wanted pictures. And his children grew up knowing that their family was different from most. Yet Robin tried to keep his children from becoming simply extensions of his celebrity. They had their own lives, their own interests, and eventually, their own careers. This was particularly important because the Williams name carried enormous expectations. When people heard Robin Williams, they thought of extraordinary comedy and unforgettable performances. For his children, that could create an unavoidable question. How do you build your own identity when your father is already a legend? The answer was different for each child. Zach moved toward advocacy and other professional interests. Zelda entered the entertainment world but developed her own creative direction. Cody largely remained away from the spotlight. Their choices showed that there wasn't one way to be part of the Williams family. And that was important. Because fame can sometimes create the illusion that everyone connected to a celebrity lives the same life. They don't. Every family member experiences it differently. Robin's career also meant that his family witnessed the enormous amount of work behind his success. Audiences saw the final performance. They saw the finished movie. They saw the comedian walking onto a stage and instantly taking control of the room. But creating that career required time, travel, rehearsals, filming, and constant professional commitments. Behind every famous performance was a person who had to balance work with family. For Robin, being a father was an important part of his life. His children were growing up while his career was constantly moving forward. Movies came and went. New roles arrived. Awards followed. But childhood only happens once. Like any parent, Robin had to navigate that balance. And his family became a place where he could step away from being Robin Williams, the entertainer. At home, he didn't have to perform. He didn't need a microphone. He didn't need an audience. He could simply be himself. That private side of Robin is one reason his children have continued speaking about him as a person rather than only as a celebrity. They remember the father behind the famous image. The man who loved his family. The man whose creativity could appear anywhere. And the person whose sense of humor could make even ordinary moments memorable. But life behind the spotlight wasn't perfect. Fame brings pressure. And Hollywood brings its own expectations. Robin's career was built around making people laugh, which created a strange expectation. People often assumed that someone who made millions laugh must always be happy. But that isn't how human emotions work. A comedian can make others laugh while still experiencing difficult moments privately. Robin's story reminds us that public happiness and private feelings are not always the same thing. His family lived alongside that reality. They saw the person behind the performances. They understood that the man on screen was only one part of who he was. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 2014, Robin Williams died. The world reacted with shock. Tributes came from actors, comedians, musicians, fans, and people who had never met him but felt as though they had. His movies returned to theaters and television. His performances were shared again. His name filled headlines. But for his children, the experience was different. The world was remembering a legend. They were remembering their father. And from that moment forward, the Williams family had to navigate something they had never experienced before. Living with Robin's legacy without Robin himself. That would become one of the most important chapters in their story. Because remembering someone is one thing. Carrying their legacy into the future is another. And Robin's children would eventually find their own ways to do both. When Robin Williams died in 2014, the world lost one of its most recognizable entertainers. But for his family, the loss was deeply personal. The man millions knew from movies and comedy specials was their father. And suddenly, the person who had been part of their lives was gone. The public reaction was enormous. Fans revisited his films. Actors shared memories. Comedians talked about his influence. And people around the world remembered the moments when Robin had made them laugh. But grief doesn't work like a movie. There is no final scene. No perfect ending. Life simply continues. For Robin's children, continuing life meant learning how to carry memories of their father while also building lives of their own. His eldest son, Zach Williams, became increasingly involved in advocacy and work focused on mental well-being. Rather than allowing his father's legacy to remain only in entertainment, Zach used his own experiences to help create conversations around emotional well-being and support. His work became one way of honoring his father. Not by copying Robin's career, but by creating something meaningful in his own direction. Zelda Williams also continued developing her career in entertainment. She explored acting, writing, directing, and other creative projects. For Zelda, creativity had always been part of her world. But after Robin's death, her relationship with that creative world inevitably carried another dimension. People often saw her through the lens of her father. But Zelda continued working to establish her own voice. Her career became a reminder that being the child of a famous person doesn't mean you have to live in their shadow forever. You can respect the past while creating something new. Cody Williams, meanwhile, has generally kept a much quieter public profile. His approach demonstrates another side of legacy. Sometimes honoring someone doesn't require being constantly visible. Sometimes it means protecting your private life and remembering your family away from cameras. 3 children. 3 different approaches. But one shared connection. Their father. Robin's legacy also continued through his work. His movies remained popular. His characters continued to introduce new generations to his talent. Films such as Mrs. Doubtfire, Good Will Hunting, Dead Poets Society, Jumanji, and Aladdin remained part of popular culture. But people increasingly began looking beyond the characters. They remembered Robin himself. His extraordinary improvisational ability. His generosity toward fellow performers. His ability to move between comedy and serious drama. And his unique way of making audiences feel like they were seeing something completely spontaneous. His children inherited that history. But they didn't have to preserve it in exactly the same way. Their lives were their own. And that may be one of the most important lessons in the Williams family story. A parent's legacy can inspire a child without controlling their future. Robin gave the world his art. His children were free to decide what they wanted to give the world. And they made different choices. That doesn't make the family legacy weaker. It makes it richer. Because Robin Williams' influence isn't limited to one person. It exists in the people he inspired. The audiences he entertained. The performers who learned from him. And the family who knew him away from the stage. Years after his death, people still discover Robin's work for the first time. A teenager watches Dead Poets Society. A family watches Mrs. Doubtfire. Someone hears his voice in Aladdin. Another person discovers one of his classic performances. And suddenly, a new generation understands why he mattered. That's the strange power of entertainment. An artist can leave this world, but their work can continue meeting people they've never known. Robin's children cannot bring their father back, but they can continue living, creating, remembering, and carrying forward the parts of him that mattered most to them. His legacy isn't simply about laughter. It's about connection. And that brings us to the final chapter. Because Robin Williams' story isn't really about how a famous actor died. It's about what remained after he was gone. The work. The memories. The family. And the influence that continues to reach people who were born long after Robin became famous. Robin Williams spent his life making people laugh. But his greatest legacy may not be the number of jokes he told or the number of movies he made. It may be the people he touched. His audience. His fellow performers. And most importantly, his family. For decades, Robin became a familiar presence in people's lives. His characters made audiences laugh. His dramatic performances made people think. And his voice became part of the childhood memories of millions. But behind the celebrity was a father whose children knew a very different side of him. Zach, Zelda, and Cody didn't need Robin Williams to be a Hollywood legend. To them, he was their dad. That personal connection became an important part of his legacy after his death. Each child chose a different path. Zach built work around advocacy and helping others. Zelda continued developing her career as a creative artist. Cody maintained a more private life. Their choices couldn't have been more different. And yet, together, they represent something important. Robin's children didn't try to recreate his life. They created their own. That may be one of the strongest ways to honor a parent. Not by becoming them, but by becoming yourself. Robin's professional legacy, meanwhile, continues to grow. His films remain popular. His performances are still studied. His comedy continues to influence younger performers. And his ability to move between completely different characters remains one of the things that made him special. He could make an audience laugh one moment, and leave them silent the next. That range was rare. But his legacy is also about something beyond acting. Robin demonstrated the power of imagination. He could take an ordinary conversation and turn it into something extraordinary. He could create characters that felt completely alive. And he could make audiences feel as though they were part of the moment. That's why his work continues to survive. A great performance doesn't belong only to the time when it was created. It can be discovered again. And again. And again. A new generation can watch Robin Williams and experience the same emotions audiences felt decades earlier. That is the real test of a lasting artist. Time passes. Culture changes. New stars appear. But some performances remain. Robin Williams is one of those performers. Yet perhaps the most meaningful part of his legacy is the reminder that celebrities are people first. The public sees the actor, the comedian, the awards, the interviews, the red carpets. But families see something else. They see the person who comes home. The parent. The sibling. The friend. The human being. Robin's family knew that version of him. And that's why their story matters. It reminds us that behind every famous face is a life that cannot be completely understood from the outside. Robin Williams made the world laugh. But his family knew that his life was much bigger than comedy. It was about relationships, memories, creativity, love, and the people who remained after the applause stopped. Today, Robin's name continues to be remembered. His films continue to be watched. His characters continue to be quoted and celebrated. And his children continue living their own lives while carrying memories of the father they knew. The Williams family story therefore doesn't have a traditional ending. Because a legacy doesn't really end. It changes. Robin's work belongs to audiences now. His memories belong to his family. And his influence belongs to the generations of performers who continue discovering what he accomplished. He left behind laughter. He left behind unforgettable characters. He left behind stories that still matter. And he left behind 3 children who each chose their own path. Perhaps that is the final lesson of Robin Williams' family story. You can inherit a name without inheriting a destiny. You can honor where you came from while still becoming your own person. And sometimes, the greatest legacy a parent can leave isn't a career. It's the freedom for their children to create one of their own. Robin Williams may no longer be here to step onto a stage. But the laughter remains. The films remain. The memories remain. And somewhere, every time someone presses play on one of his greatest performances, Robin Williams returns for a few moments. Not as a distant legend. But as the performer who could make an entire room forget everything else. And simply laugh. This was the story of Robin Williams and the family behind the man who made the world laugh.